The idea I'm talking about is the lizard brain. You've probably heard about it. It's this notion that deep inside your skull, underneath all the newer, fancier parts of your brain, there's still this old, primitive reptilian brain lurking around. And according to this idea, when you get angry or scared, that's your lizard brain taking over. It's this leftover from millions of years of evolution, just sitting there, controlling your base instincts while the rest of your brain watches helplessly. It's a wonderful story, really. It makes intuitive sense. We feel like we have these competing parts of ourselves, the rational part and the emotional, impulsive part. So having a neat little explanation, a physical explanation in terms of different brains, well, that's satisfying. And it was proposed by a neuroscientist named Paul MacLean back in the 1960s. He called it the triune brain, 3 brains in one. Now here's the thing that I find absolutely marvelous about this story. It's completely wrong. Not mostly wrong, not approximately wrong, wrong in almost every important way you can imagine. And yet, it's still everywhere. It's in textbooks, it's in pop psychology, it's in business seminars and self-help books. It's in articles telling you not to listen to your lizard brain. It's in movies and novels and blog posts all over the internet. Let me tell you how MacLean came up with this idea, because it's actually a good lesson in how even smart people can make mistakes. MacLean was studying the brains of monkeys, and he noticed something. When he removed a part of the brain he called the reptilian complex, the basal ganglia, some deeper structures, the monkey would stop doing these aggressive displays. It would stop making threats at its own reflection in a mirror. And MacLean thought, aha, this part of the brain must be left over from our reptile ancestors. It must be the primitive part, the instinctual part. So he started building this theory. He said that if you look at brain evolution, the brain is like a layer cake. The oldest layer, which we inherited from reptiles, sits at the bottom and controls basic survival stuff: feeding, fighting, fleeing. Then mammals evolved, and they added a new layer on top called the limbic system, and that's the emotional brain. And then primates came along, and they added yet another layer on top called the neocortex. And that's where all the fancy human thinking happens: language, reasoning, planning. And because MacLean believed evolution was just this additive process, where you keep adding layers and layers, he thought we still have all those old layers inside us, unchanged from when we were reptiles. So every time you get angry or scared, boom, the old reptile brain takes over. Now, Carl Sagan, the astronomer, he popularized this idea in his book, The Dragons of Eden. He had a huge platform, and the idea spread everywhere. It sounded good, it sounded scientific. It explained human behavior in a simple, satisfying way. But here's where it starts to unravel. We have to ask ourselves, what's the actual evidence? How do we know this is true? First problem, if this layer cake model were correct, if new brain structures just got piled on top of old ones without changing them, then we should expect that the reptilian complex would look the same in humans as it does in actual reptiles, and in other mammals too. But it doesn't, not even close. The structures are modified. They're different in different animals. Dolphins have a different arrangement than primates, who have a different arrangement than other mammals. Evolution doesn't work like someone stacking pancakes. It works by modifying what's already there, by tweaking it, by reshaping it. Second problem, some of the structures MacLean thought were primitive and reptilian actually appear in animals much earlier than reptiles. The basal ganglia, this supposed reptilian complex, we find them in some of the earliest jawed fish. Jawed fish came before reptiles. So if we're inheriting something from our reptilian ancestors, well, we inherited it much longer ago than that, and it's been modified in every single lineage since then. Third problem, the whole picture doesn't match what we actually know about how evolution works at the molecular level. When biologists look at the genes, when they look at how brains develop, they don't see this neat division. They see the same types of cells, the same basic building blocks, being used throughout the entire brain. The whole thing is much more integrated than MacLean imagined. And here's the part that really gets me. We know all this. The people studying evolutionary neuroscience, the people actually studying how brains develop and evolve, they've known this doesn't work for decades. Since at least the 1970s, neuroscientists were publishing papers saying, wait, this doesn't fit the data. But the idea has such intuitive appeal, it's so easy to understand, that it just keeps bouncing around in popular culture. It's one of the most successful errors in all of science. That's what researchers call it now. Now, one of my favorite ways to check if I understand something is to ask, what would it actually mean if this were true? What are the implications? Because sometimes you realize the thing you thought made sense doesn't actually make sense when you really think it through. So if we really had three separate brains competing with each other, three separate intelligences, three separate consciousnesses, as MacLean suggested, then what? That would mean your reptile brain has its own sense of time, its own awareness, its own desires. And your mammal brain has a different sense of time, a different awareness, different desires. And your human brain has yet another set. Three different subjects, all living in the same skull, all with their own opinions about what to do. That's weird when you think about it, because when you're scared, you don't feel like a reptile taking over your body. You feel like you are scared. It's not an invader. It's not an alien consciousness. It's you. Your unified consciousness is experiencing fear. And fear is not primitive or irrational, by the way. Fear is an intelligent response to danger. It's information processing. The fact that it happens quickly doesn't make it simple. Here's another thing. If your brain really was just these separate systems fighting each other, it would be a terrible design. Evolution would have done a much better job integrating things if it had millions of years to work with. But your brain isn't like that. Your brain works as a unified system. Different parts contribute to different aspects of what you do, sure, but they're all connected, they're all talking to each other, they're all working together. The structures that MacLean called the reptilian complex, they're involved in all kinds of things. Memory, emotion, decision-making, social behavior. And they're not separate from the cortex. They're integrated with it. A 2022 study had scientists comparing the brains of actual lizards and mice, trying to find common structures, trying to confirm MacLean's theory. And what they found was fascinating. The similar cell types were scattered throughout both brains, not in a layered structure. Scattered, distributed, integrated. So what we actually have is not three brains fighting each other. What we have is one brain with many different structures, many different regions that evolved from a common ancestor and were modified along the way. That's much more interesting than the layer cake model, I think. Now, you might be wondering, why am I telling you all this? Why do I care so much about whether the lizard brain is real or not? It's not like you're going to change your life, because it turns out your brain evolved differently than MacLean said. But here's why it matters. It's about how we think about ourselves. If we believe we have a primitive reptilian brain controlling our base instincts, we might think our anger or our fear or our sexual desire is something shameful, something we need to control, something that's holding us back from being truly rational and human. But that's not true. Your fear is not a reptile. Your anger is not a leftover from evolution. These are your responses. They're part of how you process the world. And they can be intelligent or unintelligent depending on whether they're appropriate to the situation. Think about it. A musician gets angry about playing the wrong note. A parent gets scared for their child's safety. A scientist gets excited about a new discovery. These are emotional responses, sure, but they're integrated with the higher cognitive processes. They're not preventing you from thinking. They're part of how you think. And there's another reason this matters. If we're going to think seriously about the nature of intelligence, we need to get this stuff right. Because that brings me to the second part of what I want to talk about today. If we don't even understand our own brains correctly, how would we recognize intelligence in something completely different? Think about this question. If aliens came to Earth, would they recognize that we're intelligent? It's an interesting question because most of the ways we measure intelligence are based on comparing other animals to us. We look at problem solving, self-awareness, tool use, language, abstract reasoning, planning for the future. And we notice that humans are really good at these things. Better than most animals anyway. So we say, okay, these are the signs of intelligence. But here's the thing. An alien species wouldn't necessarily value the same things we value. What if the aliens were highly intelligent, but they didn't care much about tools? What if they evolved without hands, so they never needed to manipulate objects? Tool use wouldn't mean anything to them. That's what I find remarkable about studying animal intelligence here on Earth. It shows us just how specialized intelligence can be. Let me give you some examples. Ravens and crows. For instance, they can solve problems that are genuinely sophisticated. They can figure out causal relationships. They can understand that if they do action A, it will cause action B. They can modify tools to suit their needs. They can plan for the future and hide food in places they'll remember later. They have culture. They pass information from one generation to the next. They recognize individual human faces. They hold grudges. But here's the thing. A crow's intelligence is specifically adapted to being a crow. A crow doesn't care about abstract mathematics. A crow doesn't wonder about the nature of reality. A crow cares about food, about its community, about solving the specific problems that being a crow presents. And for those problems, crows are remarkably smart. Elephants are another good example. Elephants are obviously intelligent. They have excellent memory. They're social. They can recognize themselves in mirrors, which is a sign of self-awareness that most animals don't have. But here's something fascinating. For a long time, researchers didn't realize how intelligent elephants were about manipulating their environment. And you know why? Because the scientists were testing elephant intelligence by giving them sticks to use as tools. But elephants interact with the world primarily through their trunks, through their sense of smell and touch. A stick barely lets them do that. It's like testing a human's intelligence by letting them only use their ears. So the researchers were measuring the wrong thing. They were measuring how well elephants could use sticks, not whether elephants could solve problems using the tools they actually have. Once they changed their approach, once they asked the right questions, they discovered that elephants are far more sophisticated in their understanding of their environment than anyone had realized. Dolphins and whales, too. They have language, complex social structures. They can recognize themselves in mirrors. They demonstrate what looks like empathy. But their intelligence is adapted to life in the ocean. They probably don't think about things the way we do. They probably have sensory experiences we can't even imagine. The dolphin's intelligence is so alien to us, it's like asking an alien. And here's something even stranger. Researchers used to think that brain size or brain-to-body ratio was the best predictor of intelligence. Bigger brains, smarter animals, right? But it's not that simple. What matters more is the absolute number of neurons, the total number of processing elements. A whale has a much bigger brain than a human, but a human has more neurons packed into a smaller space. And it turns out that when you do careful studies comparing intelligence across species, you find that different factors matter for different animals. For primates, the variety of their diet, the number of different foods they eat, correlates with how much self-control they have. Animals that need to eat many different types of food in different seasons need to be able to delay gratification to plan ahead. So they evolved better self-control. But that same factor might not matter for, say, a bird species. Birds and mammals have completely different brain structures, different evolutionary histories. You can't just say more brain power equals more intelligence. It's not that simple. And here's something really wild that I think about. What about octopuses? Octopuses are incredibly intelligent. They're problem solvers. They can use tools. They have good memory. They show individual personalities. But the interesting thing about octopuses is that their brain is not in their head. They have a central brain, sure, but about 2/3 of their neurons are distributed throughout their 8 arms. Each arm can solve problems somewhat independently. An octopus can lose an arm and still survive and still use that lost arm's neurons aren't coming back. They were local to that arm. So the octopus is intelligent in a fundamentally different way than we are. The octopus's intelligence is distributed. It's embodied in a different configuration. If an alien looked at an octopus and compared it to a human, how would it decide which one is more intelligent? It depends on what you're measuring. It depends on what you value. Now, think about this from the perspective of a truly alien civilization. Let's say they evolved on a planet with very different conditions. Maybe they never evolved hands because their world didn't require that kind of tool use. Maybe they evolved as a collective intelligence, like a hive mind, so individual consciousness isn't really relevant. Maybe they evolved in an aquatic environment and they're thinking in 3 dimensions in ways we can't easily access. Maybe they evolved without anything like our kind of language, and they communicate through some method we don't have sensory organs for. How would they recognize human intelligence? They might look at our brains and say, these are interesting, but they're optimized for this planet, with this gravity, with this atmosphere. They're built for tool use with these 2 hands, and these 2 legs, and this bipedal body plan. They're adapted for life in a social group of moderate size. They process information through language, through symbolic representation. But these are all specific adaptations. These don't tell us about the essence of intelligence. Or they might look at us and not recognize intelligence at all. They might think we're more like, I don't know, animated meat robots. The way we use our hands reflexively, the way we use our voices reflexively, the way we sometimes make decisions from emotions rather than pure logic, to a truly alien mind. Some of this might look like simple stimulus response, not intelligence at all. Or here's another possibility. They might recognize something completely different as intelligent than what we think of as intelligent. You see, we measure intelligence in humans using tests, IQ tests and so on. And what do these tests measure? Language, mathematical reasoning, spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, mostly things that require our kind of brain. We're measuring how similar you are to the average human. But intelligence isn't really one thing. It's a collection of different capacities. The ability to solve problems, the ability to learn from experience, the ability to understand cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, the ability to work together with others, the ability to recognize patterns, the ability to adapt to new situations. Different animals have these capacities in different amounts. A crow might be better at some things than an elephant. An elephant might be better at others. A dog might be better at reading social cues from humans than any wild animal, because it evolved alongside us. It learned to understand us. A parrot might be able to understand concepts about quantities and relationships that a dog doesn't grasp. If we can't even agree on how to measure intelligence when we're comparing animals that evolved on the same planet in similar ways, with similar constraints, how in the world would we measure it for an alien? The person who is studying animal intelligence, they have to do something fascinating. They have to test the animal on the animal's terms. You can't expect a bird to use tools the way a primate does. You have to ask, what does this animal naturally do? What is this animal adapted for? And then you test whether it can do more sophisticated versions of those things. A crow can use tools, but that's not how crows in nature use tools. They have to be specially trained. What crows naturally do is forage for food, navigate their environment, remember things, interact with other crows. So when you test crow intelligence, you should be testing those capacities. And when you do that, you find that crows are sometimes smarter than we expect. So here's what I'm getting at. Recognizing intelligence requires understanding what the being actually does, what it needs to do, what it's optimized for. And that's hard even when you're dealing with animals on your own planet. It's much harder when you're dealing with something totally alien. And I think there's a deeper point here too. When we look at ourselves, when we think about human intelligence, we have this tendency to see it as the peak, the top of the hierarchy. We have language, we have abstract reasoning, we can imagine things that don't exist. We can create art and mathematics and philosophy. And these are genuinely remarkable capacities. But they're not the only kinds of intelligence. A dog's ability to read human emotional states with incredible accuracy, that's intelligence. A bird's ability to navigate across the entire planet using the Earth's magnetic field, that's intelligence. An elephant's ability to remember every water source it's ever seen over a lifetime, that's intelligence. These are examples of sophisticated information processing, of adaptation, of learning. They're just different from ours. Now, here's something that brings us back to the lizard brain idea. For a long time, we thought of human intelligence as something that required the neocortex, the newest, latest, fanciest part of our brain. We thought of the older parts of the brain as primitive, as basic, as just handling instinct. But that's not how it works. The older parts of the brain are involved in everything. Memory isn't just in the cortex. It's distributed throughout the brain. Emotion isn't just in some primitive system. It's integrated with cognition. Decision-making isn't a pure logic exercise happening in the cortex. It involves emotional signals. It involves older structures. It involves the whole brain working together. In fact, people who have damage to emotional systems, people who can't feel emotions properly, they actually have worse decision-making. They can't plan for the future effectively. They can't weigh options. Because emotions are part of how we think. They're not obstacles to thinking. They're part of thinking. So if an alien encountered us and thought, these creatures have emotions, they have irrational responses, they get scared and angry, they might conclude we're not truly intelligent. But they'd be making a mistake. They'd be using a metric that's not appropriate for understanding how we actually think. Unless the alien is so different from us that what we call intelligence wouldn't be recognizable to them at all. Think about this. Could there be a form of intelligence so different from ours that we wouldn't recognize it as intelligence? Could there be something smart that we just look at and think is a rock or a plant or something inert? There are some scientists who think about questions like this. They talk about things like collective intelligence or distributed intelligence. What if a mycelial network, a fungal network in the soil, is actually solving sophisticated problems, making decisions, communicating in ways we just don't recognize because we're not looking for them on that scale? Or what if intelligence can happen in something that's not even biological? Could a weather system be intelligent? Could a forest ecosystem be intelligent? I'm not saying this is true, but I'm asking, how would we know? How would we know what to look for? And here's the thing. If we can't even recognize intelligence in animals that we share a planet with, animals that we can observe and study and test, how confident can we really be that we'd recognize intelligence in something totally alien? The question, would aliens recognize human intelligence, becomes really interesting when you think about it this way. Because it's not really a question about aliens at all. It's a question about us. It's a question about, what do we think intelligence is? What are we measuring when we measure it? And are we measuring the right things? Because here's what I notice. We tend to measure intelligence in ourselves. We develop tests that measure how well humans can do certain tasks, and then we apply those same tests to animals and say, well, a dog scored lower on human tests, so a dog is less intelligent than a human. But that's circular reasoning. You're using human standards to measure non-human intelligence, and then you're surprised that humans come out on top. What would happen if you used dog standards? What if you measured how good different animals are at reading human facial expressions and emotional states? How many animals can do what a dog can do? Most animals can't do it at all. Humans are worse at it than dogs, actually. We have to learn to read the subtle signs of what someone else is feeling. Dogs just know. There's an intelligence there that we don't have. So when we ask, would aliens recognize human intelligence? Maybe the real question is, would they recognize intelligence using their own framework? Would they say these creatures have remarkable abilities in these specific domains? Or would they look at us and say these creatures are adapted for this particular ecological niche? But there's nothing especially remarkable about their cognition. I think the honest answer is, it depends entirely on the aliens. If the aliens evolved to have hands and use tools and develop language and build technology, then they probably recognize our intelligence pretty quickly. We'd have a lot in common. We'd be able to communicate, eventually. We could exchange ideas about mathematics, about physics, about how to solve problems. But if the aliens are fundamentally different, if they don't have language in any meaningful sense, if they don't use tools, if they don't have an individual consciousness the way we do, then maybe our intelligence would just look random and chaotic to them. Maybe they'd look at human behavior and see nothing but pattern and survival and reproduction, the same things you see in any animal. You know what fascinates me? When biologists study animal behavior, they find that behavior isn't determined by how much cortex you have, or whether you have a neocortex at all. They find that behavior is determined by what matters for that animal's survival and reproduction. A lizard might seem stupid to us, but if you put a lizard in its natural environment, it solves problems very efficiently. It finds food, it avoids predators, it finds mates, it reproduces successfully. That's intelligence adapted to the lizard's life. And a human placed in a totally alien environment with different rules, different constraints, the human might not be that much smarter than the lizard. A human's intelligence is adapted for life in human society, using human language, with human social structures. So here's what I think is really interesting. The lizard brain myth tells us something important. It tells us that we don't really understand our own brains very well. We're still making up stories about how things work, and some of those stories are wrong, but they're so appealing that they persist. And that suggests that if we met an alien civilization, we might be making the same mistakes in reverse. We might be looking at them and trying to fit them into our categories. We might be saying they have language, so they're intelligent, or they don't have language, so they're not. But the categories might not apply. Intelligence might be more like the spectrum of light. We see red and blue and green, and those are the colors that matter for our eyes. But there's ultraviolet and infrared that we can't see at all. There are radio waves and X-rays. There's a whole spectrum that our eyes just don't detect. But the spectrum is still there, still real. Maybe intelligence is like that too. Maybe there are forms of intelligence that we just don't have the capacity to recognize. And maybe there are alien intelligences that would look at us and see, well, something that's not quite on their spectrum, something that registers, maybe, but not in the category they'd call intelligent. Or maybe, and I think this is the most interesting possibility, maybe intelligence is what I'd call substrate independent. Maybe the specific details of how you're built don't matter as much as what you do. And what humans do is remarkable. We solve problems, we create, we cooperate on a large scale, we figure out how the universe works. We do this using our specific kind of brain, our specific kind of body, our specific kind of environment. But we do it. Would an alien recognize that? Would it say these creatures are intelligent? Or would it say these creatures are interesting, but not in a way that maps onto what I call intelligence? Honestly, I don't know, but I think the question is worth asking because it makes us think about what intelligence really is. And I think if we're going to think seriously about whether aliens would recognize human intelligence, we should at least get the facts right about how our own intelligence works. We should stop believing in the lizard brain. We should stop thinking of emotions as primitive, of instinct as opposed to reason. We should understand that our brains are unified systems, that different parts work together, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Because understanding ourselves correctly is probably our best shot at recognizing intelligence in something totally different from us. Let me just say this in conclusion. The lizard brain is not real. It's a myth. But it's a useful myth in one sense. It shows us how easy it is to believe wrong things, how appealing a good story can be, how we should always look carefully at the evidence before we accept something as true. And if that same skeptical approach was applied to how we think about intelligence, about what it means for something to be smart, about how we'd recognize intelligence in an alien, well, I think we'd be asking better questions. We'd be less confident that we know what intelligence looks like. We'd be more willing to consider possibilities that don't fit neatly into our categories. And that, I think, is a much more interesting position to be in. Because the universe is a big place, and there are probably things out there that we can't easily understand using the categories we've developed for our own planet. And that's exciting. So that's what I wanted to talk about. The lizard brain isn't real, but the way we talk about it tells us something real about how we think, about our biases, about our assumptions. And thinking about whether aliens would recognize our intelligence tells us something important about what we think intelligence actually is. Thank you.